Some doors don't stay closed because they're locked, but because something inside is still waiting to be found. The road narrowed into a single strip of gravel as Ethan Cole eased his old pickup through the pines, tires crunching slowly beneath him, the sound echoing farther than it should in the stillness of the late afternoon. The forest stretched tall and quiet on both sides, a cathedral of dark green and fading light, and somewhere beyond the trees, unseen but always present, a lake rested like a sheet of cold glass beneath the sky. Beside him, Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a silver-gray coat and sharp amber eyes that missed nothing, his posture steady, alert in a way that wasn't restless but deliberate, as if every movement around them was being measured against something older than instinct. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting absently near the dog's collar, his fingers brushing the worn leather like it anchored him to something real. At 40, his face carried the quiet weight of years spent in places where silence meant danger or survival, his jaw rough with stubble, his dark hair streaked faintly with gray at the temples, and his eyes, steel blue and distant, held the kind of focus that never fully switched off. He hadn't planned on coming this far north, not really, but when the listing appeared, a cabin, cheap, remote, overlooked, something in him had answered before his mind caught up, as if distance alone could quiet what followed him. The trees thinned just enough for the structure to appear ahead, half hidden in shadow, a small wooden cabin pressed into the edge of the forest, its weathered boards faded to a dull gray, the roof sloping slightly under the weight of time. It didn't look abandoned exactly, but it didn't look lived in either, as though it existed in the space between being remembered and being forgotten. Ethan slowed the truck to a crawl, gravel popping beneath the tires as he pulled to a stop about 20 feet from the front steps. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, the sound fading into a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan exhaled, long and steady, and reached for the door handle. Rex didn't follow. The man stepped out first, boots pressing into the thin layer of dust and pine needles, the air carrying a faint scent of cold wood and distant water, clean but edged with something metallic he couldn't quite place. He stretched slightly, rolling his shoulders as if shedding the stiffness of the drive, then glanced back toward the truck. Rex was still inside, unmoving, ears lifted, gaze fixed not on Ethan but on the cabin itself. "Hey," Ethan called softly, a note of confusion threading through his voice. "Come on, boy." The dog didn't respond. He didn't whine or bark or shift his weight. He simply watched, body rigid in a way that didn't signal fear so much as refusal, as if an invisible line had been drawn somewhere between the truck and the front door, and he had already decided not to cross it. Ethan frowned slightly, stepping closer and opening the passenger door wider. "Rex," he said again, quieter this time, almost coaxing. The shepherd's ears twitched, but his paws stayed planted, claws faintly clicking against the worn floor mat as he leaned back just enough to resist without making a scene. It wasn't like him. Rex had followed Ethan through worse than this: storms, broken roads, nights colder than reason, and never once hesitated without cause. Ethan crouched slightly, bringing himself level with the dog's gaze, studying him the way he'd learned to read subtle changes years ago. The animal's eyes weren't panicked, not wide with fear, but focused, locked onto the dark rectangle of the cabin's doorway, as if something beyond it was speaking in a language only he could hear. A breeze moved lightly through the trees, stirring the branches above, but it didn't reach the cabin. The air around it remained still, heavy in a way that pressed quietly against the senses. Ethan straightened, glancing toward the structure again, noticing for the first time how the front door sat just slightly ajar, not wide open, but not fully closed either, like a breath caught between in and out. He stepped toward it, boots sounding louder now in the silence, each footfall measured without him realizing why, and behind him, the truck remained open, Rex still inside, watching, waiting. Just before Ethan reached the bottom step, he paused, not because he saw anything change, but because something felt different, as if the quiet itself had shifted. He turned his head slightly, listening, though there was no wind, no movement, no voice, only the faint, almost imperceptible suggestion of a sound, like something tapping gently from somewhere deeper than the walls should allow. He stood there a moment longer, the weight of that silence settling into him, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he didn't call Rex again. Somewhere behind him, the dog lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of something already unfolding. And the cabin, patient and unmoving, seemed to wait. The wooden steps creaked softly under Ethan's weight as he climbed, each sound stretching farther than it should in the still air, as if the cabin itself was listening to his approach. The door stood a few inches open, swaying ever so slightly though the breeze never quite reached it, and up close he could see the grain of the wood worn smooth in places, like hands had touched it many times long ago and then simply stopped. He paused at the threshold, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior where shadows gathered in the corners and the light from outside barely pushed its way in. Behind him, the truck remained where he left it, and though he did not turn, he could feel Rex's attention still fixed on him, steady and unwavering. "It is just a place," Ethan murmured under his breath, more to settle his own thoughts than to convince the dog, and with that, he stepped inside. The air changed immediately, cooler than outside, but not with the kind of chill that came from weather. It felt deeper, like the cold held onto the wood and stone themselves, a quiet, settled presence that had nowhere to go. The floorboards beneath his boots gave a low, hollow response, not weak, but echoing in a way that hinted at space below, and that thought lingered just long enough to make him slow his next step. He let the door rest where it was, neither closing it nor opening it further, as if leaving it undecided felt safer somehow, then moved forward into the main room. Dust lay thin across the surfaces, not thick enough to suggest years of neglect, but enough to tell him no one had been here recently, and the scent in the air carried faint traces of pine, old fabric, and something metallic that seemed stronger now that he was inside. A small table stood near the far wall, one chair slightly pulled back as though someone had stood up and never returned, and to the left, a narrow hallway disappeared into shadow. Everything looked ordinary, yet nothing felt settled. Ethan exhaled slowly, scanning the room with the quiet habit of someone who trusted observation more than assumption, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then it came again. Tap. A soft, measured sound, so faint it might have been mistaken for settling wood, except it repeated, spaced just far enough apart to feel intentional. Tap, tap. Ethan's head turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he listened, the rhythm stirring something distant in his memory, something he could not immediately place. He took a slow step toward the center of the room, then another, each movement deliberate, as if moving too quickly might break whatever fragile connection had allowed him to hear it at all. Behind him, outside, Rex shifted in the truck, a low sound rising from his chest, not a growl but something deeper, a recognition carried on instinct alone. Ethan stopped, his boot resting on a section of floor that felt subtly different beneath his weight, not unstable, but resonant, like the surface of something hollow and waiting. He did not move immediately, instead lowering his gaze, studying the pattern of the boards where faint scratches marked the wood in irregular lines. Not fresh, not obvious, but there if one knew to look. The tapping came again, softer now, almost like an echo of itself. Tap. A quiet pulse beneath his feet. Ethan crouched slowly, placing his hand flat against the floor, his fingers splayed across the grain as he stilled himself completely. For a moment, there was nothing, just the cool texture of the wood against his skin. Then he felt it. Not a vibration exactly, but a subtle shift, like a breath moving through something buried deep below. His expression changed, not to fear, but to recognition, a memory rising from somewhere long buried. Nights spent listening for signs beneath collapsed structures, waiting for patterns that meant life, or at least the possibility of it. He withdrew his hand slowly, his gaze lingering on that single section of floor, and for the first time since arriving, he did not think about leaving. Outside, Rex let out a single, low sound, his ears still fixed forward, as if whatever lay beneath the cabin had just acknowledged them both. And inside, the silence returned, but it was no longer empty. The feeling did not leave when Ethan stood up. It stayed with him the way certain memories do, quiet but persistent, pressing gently at the edges of his awareness until they could no longer be ignored. He remained still for a moment longer, listening not just with his ears, but with that deeper instinct that had once kept him alive in places where hesitation carried a cost. And though the cabin remained silent on the surface, something beneath it held a rhythm that was too steady to be random. Outside, the faint sound of movement reached him as Rex shifted again, claws brushing against the metal edge of the truck's floor, followed by a low, deliberate exhale that carried more meaning than any bark. The dog was not panicking, not trying to escape. He was waiting, and that difference settled something inside Ethan rather than alarming him. He turned his head slightly toward the doorway, catching a narrow slice of fading daylight where the trees beyond stood unmoving, their shadows stretching long across the ground. And for a brief moment, he considered stepping back outside, not out of fear, but out of habit, the old instinct to regroup, to observe from a safer distance before committing to what came next. But the sound came again. Tap. Softer now, yet closer somehow, as if whatever caused it had shifted just enough to be felt more clearly through the wood beneath his feet. Ethan exhaled slowly and crouched once more, this time lowering himself fully to one knee, his palm returning to the same section of floor with greater intention. He pressed down gently at first, then with more weight, testing not just the surface but the space beneath it. And this time he noticed something he had missed before, a slight give in the board, not loose enough to lift easily, but not fixed as solidly as the others around it. His fingers traced along the edge, following a faint seam that had been carefully aligned to blend with the rest of the floor, and the realization came not as a shock, but as a quiet confirmation of something he had already begun to understand. "All right," he murmured under his breath, the words steady, almost calm, as if he were speaking to both the cabin and the dog at the same time. He shifted his weight and pressed harder along the seam, feeling for a point where the resistance changed, where intention met design, and after a moment, he found it, a narrow indentation just deep enough for his fingers to catch. The wood resisted at first, held in place by time and stillness more than force, but with a careful pull, it lifted slightly, releasing a soft creak that echoed downward rather than outward. The air changed again, subtly but unmistakably, as a cooler current rose from below, carrying with it a scent older than the cabin itself, something like damp stone mixed with metal and the faintest trace of oil, a smell that did not belong to the forest above. Ethan paused, holding the board partially lifted, his eyes fixed on the dark gap that had appeared beneath it, and for the first time since he arrived, his heartbeat aligned with the rhythm he had been hearing, not matching it exactly, but recognizing its pattern. Outside, Rex finally moved. The truck shifted slightly as the dog stepped down to the ground, his paws landing with controlled precision, and though Ethan could not see him directly, he heard the soft approach, the measured steps that stopped just at the threshold of the cabin door. Rex did not enter. Instead, he stood there, close enough now that his presence filled the space behind Ethan, yet still respecting that invisible line he had refused to cross earlier. A low sound left his chest. Not warning, not fear, but something closer to acknowledgement. Ethan glanced back briefly, meeting the dog's gaze, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them that required no words. Then he turned forward again, lifting the board a little higher, enough to reveal the outline of what lay beneath, not just empty space, but a structure, deliberate, hidden, and waiting. And whatever it was, it had not been built to be forgotten. The opening widened with a quiet reluctance, the wooden panel lifting just enough for Ethan to see past the surface and into the space below, and what revealed itself was not the rough emptiness of a crawlspace, but something far more deliberate, a narrow frame of reinforced metal set beneath the cabin floor, its edges worn but intact, as though it had been built to endure long after the world above it changed. The faint tapping stopped the moment the air shifted, replaced instead by a deeper stillness that carried weight rather than absence. Ethan adjusted his grip and carefully eased the panel aside, setting it down without letting it fall, every movement controlled, measured, the way he had learned to handle anything unknown. And as the opening cleared, a faint glow appeared from below, not bright, not artificial in the usual sense, but a dim, steady light that pulsed softly against the darkness like something alive but restrained. He leaned forward slightly, peering into the opening, and saw the outline of a narrow staircase descending into the ground. Each step formed from the same metal frame, coated in a thin layer of dust that had settled over time, but not enough to erase the path. It was not abandoned, not completely, and that realization settled deeper than any fear might have. Behind him, Rex shifted again at the threshold, his paws stepping just inside the cabin for the first time, but no farther, his body angled toward Ethan, ears forward, eyes fixed not on the opening itself but on the man, as if measuring his choice rather than the space below. Ethan glanced back briefly, noticing the change, the dog crossing the line he had refused earlier, but only just, and it told him everything he needed to know. Not that it was safe, but that whatever lay beneath was meant to be faced, not avoided. He returned his attention to the opening and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small flashlight, the metal casing worn from years of use. And when he switched it on, the beam cut cleanly through the dim glow below, revealing more detail, a railing along one side of the stairs, a wall lined with smooth panels, and at the base, something that resembled a door, solid and closed. The light from his flashlight flickered briefly, just once, before stabilizing, and though the battery was steady, the moment lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Ethan rested one hand on the edge of the opening and placed his foot on the first step, testing the weight, feeling the solid resistance beneath him, and for a second, the old instinct returned again, the one that reminded him that once he went down, the space above would no longer be the same, that thresholds worked both ways. The air rising from below carried that same metallic scent, stronger now, mixed with something else, something faintly warm, like a machine that had once run and might still remember how. He paused halfway into the descent, listening again, not for the tapping, but for anything that might replace it, but the silence held, deep and steady, like a held breath waiting to be released. Behind him, Rex let out a low, controlled sound, and when Ethan turned slightly, he saw the dog had taken one more step forward, just enough that his front paws rested inside the cabin, but his back legs remained planted near the doorway, bridging two spaces at once. Ethan gave a small nod, more to himself than the dog, then turned forward again and began to descend, each step carrying him farther from the fading light above and deeper into whatever had been waiting beneath the cabin for far longer than he had known it existed. And as his boots met the lower steps, the faint glow below seemed to respond, not brighter, not stronger, but aware, as if the space itself had finally been entered by someone who was meant to find it. The final step met Ethan's weight with a muted, solid sound, the kind that confirmed intention rather than accident. And as he moved fully off the staircase, the space around him revealed itself in quiet layers, not all at once, but gradually, as if it required patience to be understood. The ceiling was lower than the cabin above, reinforced with metal beams that ran parallel across the width, each one evenly spaced and still carrying a faint sheen beneath the thin dust, suggesting they had not been forgotten entirely, and the walls, smooth and deliberate, held a texture that spoke of careful construction rather than improvisation. The dim glow he had seen from above came from a series of small fixtures embedded along the walls, not bright enough to illuminate everything clearly, but steady, consistent, and somehow still functioning after what must have been years of silence, casting a pale amber light that softened the edges of the room rather than defining them. Ethan swept the beam of his flashlight slowly across the space, not because he needed it, but because habit demanded verification, and what he saw made him pause in a way he had not since entering the cabin. This was not storage, not a forgotten basement or a hidden cache left behind in haste. This was a room that had purpose, a place that had once been used with care and intention. Along one wall stood a narrow workbench, its surface cleared but marked with faint impressions where tools had once rested, and above it, mounted neatly, were brackets that now stood empty, their outlines suggesting something precise had been kept there for a long time. To the right, a small table held a single object, a metal box no larger than a lunch container, its lid closed, its surface worn smooth at the edges as if it had been handled often. Ethan stepped closer, his movements slower now, more deliberate, not out of fear, but out of respect for the space he had entered, and as he moved, the air shifted slightly around him, carrying a faint warmth that did not belong to the temperature of the earth, but to something that had once generated life within these walls. Behind him, above, the cabin remained silent, and though he could not see Rex, he felt the absence of the dog's presence below as clearly as if it were a boundary drawn in the air. Rex had not followed, and that choice lingered in Ethan's mind not as hesitation, but as guidance, as if the dog had brought him to this point and trusted him to go the rest of the way alone. The memory of the tapping returned then, not as sound, but as pattern, and Ethan found himself glancing toward the far side of the room, where the light seemed just slightly dimmer, where the walls curved inward by a fraction that most would never notice. But to him, it stood out immediately, a deviation from symmetry that suggested something concealed behind the surface. He approached slowly, the beam of his flashlight tracing the line where the panel met the floor, and there, barely visible, was a seam, narrower than the one above, but present, intentional, waiting. He stopped just short of touching it, his hand hovering for a moment as the quiet pressed in around him. And in that stillness, he realized something that settled deeper than any discovery so far. The tapping had not been random. It had been a signal, not to warn, but to guide. Ethan lowered his hand and pressed lightly against the panel, feeling for movement, for resistance, for any sign that the structure would respond. And as his fingers made contact, the faintest shift occurred, not in the wall, but in the air itself, like a held breath finally released. Somewhere above, near the cabin doorway, Rex let out a single, low sound, distant but clear, and Ethan understood then that whatever he was about to uncover had not been hidden to keep people out, but to ensure that only the right moment and the right person would find it. And as he applied a little more pressure to the concealed seam, the room seemed to listen. The panel did not move at first, and for a brief moment Ethan thought he had misread the structure, that what he saw as intention was only coincidence shaped by his own expectation. But then beneath his palm, something shifted, not outward, not fully, but just enough to confirm that the wall was not as solid as it appeared. He adjusted his stance, placing his weight more evenly, and pressed again with quiet patience rather than force. The way one tests a mechanism rather than breaks it. The response came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if whatever lay behind the panel had not been disturbed in a long time and needed to remember how to open. A soft internal release echoed through the metal, subtle but distinct, followed by a narrow gap forming along the seam, just wide enough for a line of darker shadow to appear. Ethan withdrew his hand slightly, giving the panel space, and watched as it eased open another inch on its own, guided by something unseen but still functional, until it revealed a shallow compartment set into the wall, its interior shielded from the rest of the room, as though it had been designed to protect what it held from both time and chance. The amber light reached inside only partially, leaving the back of the compartment in soft shadow. But even from where he stood, Ethan could see that this space was different from everything else below the cabin, cleaner, more preserved, untouched by the dust that had settled everywhere else. He stepped closer, lowering his flashlight to illuminate the interior, and the beam settled on a single object resting at the center, placed with deliberate care, as if it had been left not for storage, but for discovery. It was a small wooden case, rectangular, no more than 12 inches long, its surface smooth and darkened with age, the edges reinforced with thin metal bands that had dulled but not corroded, and at the front, a simple latch held it closed, not locked, but secured enough to suggest it was meant to be opened by someone who understood its significance. Ethan did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he studied it, the way he had studied countless unfamiliar objects before, looking for signs of purpose, of intention, of story, and what struck him most was not what the box was, but how it had been left, centered, balanced, as though whoever placed it there had taken a moment to ensure it would be found exactly like this. Above him, the world remained still, but somewhere near the cabin entrance, Rex shifted again, a faint scrape of movement carrying down the stairwell, followed by a low, steady breath that felt less like concern and more like quiet confirmation. Ethan extended his hand slowly, fingers hovering just above the lid of the case, and for a second, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the sense that whatever he was about to uncover would not just explain the space around him, but something within himself that had remained unresolved for far longer than he cared to admit. The air felt different here, not colder, not heavier, but purposeful, like the pause before something meaningful reveals itself. And in that stillness, Ethan finally placed his hand on the lid and lifted the latch. The sound it made was soft, almost gentle, a small metallic click that echoed faintly against the walls. And as the lid began to rise, the light from his flashlight caught the inside just enough to reveal that this was not a container of valuables or forgotten supplies, but something far more personal, something left behind with intention rather than abandonment. And in that moment, Ethan understood that the cabin had not been empty when he arrived. It had simply been waiting for someone who would know how to listen. The lid opened slowly, not because it resisted, but because Ethan lifted it with a care that matched the quiet weight of the moment. And inside the wooden case, there was no gold, no documents stamped with authority, nothing that spoke of wealth or power in the way most hidden things did, but instead, resting against the soft lining, were items arranged with a kind of simple precision that carried more meaning than anything of value ever could. A folded letter lay on top, its paper aged but preserved, the edges slightly worn as if it had been handled many times before being placed here, and beneath it, partially visible, was a small, tarnished military badge and a thin metal chain holding a single identification tag, the kind that carried a name, a number, and a story that rarely left the person who wore it. Ethan did not touch the objects immediately. Instead, he studied them, the way he had learned to read meaning in small details, and something about the arrangement told him this was not a collection of memories left behind by accident, but a message, carefully prepared, waiting for someone who would understand what it meant. He reached in slowly and lifted the letter first, the paper lighter than he expected, yet carrying a presence that settled into his hand with quiet certainty. And when he unfolded it, the faint sound of the crease breaking echoed softly in the stillness, as if even that simple action had not occurred in a very long time. The handwriting inside was steady, deliberate, each word formed with care, and though the ink had faded slightly, the message remained clear, as though it had been written with the expectation that time would pass before it was read. Ethan's eyes moved across the page, not rushing, absorbing each line with the same patience the space itself demanded, and as he read, something within him shifted, not abruptly, but gradually, like a memory returning piece by piece. The letter did not speak of fear or warning. It spoke of waiting, of choosing to step away from the world above and build something below it, not to hide, but to preserve something that mattered, something that could not survive in the noise of everyday life. It spoke of listening, of learning to hear what others overlooked, and of trusting that one day, someone would arrive who could understand the difference between silence and absence. Ethan lowered the letter slightly, his gaze lingering on the final lines, and though he did not read them aloud, their meaning settled into him with a quiet clarity that felt almost familiar, as if the message had been written not just for anyone, but for someone like him. Behind him, far above, the faint sound of Rex's movement reached down the stairwell, a soft shift of pause followed by a single, low breath, and for the first time since entering the space below, Ethan felt the presence of the dog not as distance, but as connection, as if Rex had known all along what waited here, not in detail, but in purpose. Ethan placed the letter carefully back into the case, then lifted the identification tag, turning it slightly in the dim light, the metal catching the faint glow from the wall fixtures, and as he read the engraved name, a deeper realization began to form, one that reached beyond the cabin, beyond the hidden room, into something far more personal, something that connected the past to the present in a way that could not be explained by chance alone. The air in the room seemed to settle around him, not heavier, not lighter, but complete, as if the act of opening the case had fulfilled something that had remained unfinished for years. And as Ethan stood there, holding the small piece of metal between his fingers, he understood that this place had not been built to be discovered by accident. It had been left behind with intention, waiting for someone who would recognize that some things are not meant to be found quickly, but at the exact moment they are needed most. The name on the metal tag settled into Ethan's mind with a quiet weight that did not belong to coincidence. And as he held it there between his fingers, something deeper began to take shape. Not a memory of a face or a moment, but a recognition of pattern, of paths that cross long before anyone notices they were ever connected. The letter had spoken of waiting, of choosing silence over noise. And now, standing in that hidden room beneath the cabin, Ethan understood that the man who had built this place had not disappeared. He had simply stepped out of sight, leaving behind a message that could only be understood by someone who had learned to listen the same way. He lowered the tag slowly and placed it back into the case, his movements careful, almost reverent, as though disturbing the order of things would break the meaning they carried. And for a moment, he remained still, letting the quiet settle fully around him, no longer searching for sound, but allowing it to come if it needed to. And then, just as softly as before, it returned. Tap. Not from beneath him this time, but from somewhere along the wall behind the workbench, a faint, deliberate rhythm that carried no urgency, only intention, as if it were not trying to be heard by anyone, but simply acknowledging that someone was finally there to receive it. Ethan turned slowly, his gaze moving across the room until it settled on the workbench again, and this time, he noticed something he had overlooked before, not because it was hidden, but because it had blended too perfectly with everything else. The empty brackets above the bench were not entirely empty. One of them held a small, thin rod, barely visible against the wall, its surface worn smooth from use. He stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight catching the object just enough to define its shape, and as he reached for it, the tapping stopped, not abruptly, but naturally, like the end of a sentence rather than the interruption of one. The rod felt balanced in his hand, lighter than it looked, and as he turned it, he saw faint markings etched along its length, subtle grooves that suggested it had been used not as a tool of force, but of precision. His eyes moved back to the wall panel he had opened, then to the rest of the room, and finally to the far corner where the structure curved slightly inward, the same place he had noticed earlier, the same place where the light seemed just a little dimmer. He walked toward it with steady steps, the rod held loosely at his side, not yet certain of its purpose, but aware that it belonged to whatever came next. The air shifted again as he approached, the warmth deepening slightly, and when he reached the curved section of wall, he saw it clearly now, a narrow opening no wider than an inch, running vertically from waist height down toward the floor, too precise to be a flaw, too subtle to be accidental. Ethan crouched slightly and brought the rod closer, aligning it with the opening without hesitation, as though something beyond thought guided the motion, and when the tip slid into place, it fit perfectly, not loosely, not forced, but exactly as intended. He paused there, his hand resting lightly on the rod, feeling the stillness of the room gather around him once more, and in that moment, he understood that this was not a lock in the usual sense. It was a continuation, a final step in something that had been designed to unfold only in sequence. Above him, far beyond the layers of wood and earth, Rex let out a single, quiet sound, not a warning, not a call, but something closer to affirmation, and Ethan allowed himself one steady breath before gently turning the rod. The response came immediately, a soft internal movement within the wall, followed by a low, smooth shift that echoed through the space, like something waking after a long rest. And as the section of wall began to open, revealing a deeper chamber beyond, Ethan realized that what he had found so far was not the destination, but the introduction to something far more meaningful than he had ever expected to uncover. The wall opened with a quiet certainty, revealing a deeper chamber that felt less like an extension and more like a conclusion, a space not built for storage or survival, but for something far more intentional, something that carried the weight of completion rather than concealment. The air inside was warmer, not by much, but enough to soften the sharp edge of the underground stillness, and the light within it was different too. Not the dim amber of the outer room, but a gentle, steady glow that seemed to come from no single source, as if the space itself held on to the last traces of something once alive. Ethan stepped forward slowly, the rod still in his hand, though he no longer needed it, and as he crossed the threshold, he felt the shift immediately, not in temperature or sound, but in presence, like stepping into a place that had already been prepared for him long before he knew it existed. The chamber was smaller, more contained, its walls lined with smooth panels that bore no markings, no seams, nothing to suggest hidden mechanisms or further secrets. And at the center stood a simple wooden chair facing a narrow desk, both positioned with quiet precision as though they had been left exactly as intended. On the desk rested a single object, a journal, its cover worn but intact, the pages within slightly uneven from use, and beside it, a small lantern, its glass clear, its metal polished in a way that told him it had been cared for until the very end. Ethan approached with steady steps, his flashlight now lowered at his side, unnecessary in the soft glow that filled the room, and as he reached the desk, he paused, not because he hesitated, but because something within him recognized the moment for what it was, not discovery, but arrival. He set the rod gently on the surface and placed his hand on the journal, feeling the texture of the cover beneath his fingers, and when he opened it, the pages revealed lines of writing that mirrored the letter above, steady, deliberate, written by someone who understood time not as something to race against, but something to prepare for. He read slowly, not trying to reach the end, but allowing each word to settle, and what unfolded was not a story of escape or fear, but of choice, of a man who had stepped away from the world not because he had nothing left, but because he had learned that some things could only be preserved in silence, in patience, in waiting for the right person to continue what he had begun. The final pages spoke not of instructions, but of trust, of the belief that whoever found this place would not need to be told what to do next, because they would already understand why it mattered. Ethan closed the journal gently, his hand resting on it for a moment longer, and in that stillness, something within him settled in a way it had not for years, not through answers, but through alignment, as if the path that had brought him here had always been leading to this exact point. Above him, faint but clear, he heard Rex move at the edge of the cabin, a soft step followed by a quiet exhale, and this time, the sound carried no distance, only presence, as if the boundary between above and below had dissolved into something shared. Ethan straightened slowly and looked around the chamber one last time, not searching for more, but acknowledging what had been given, and as he turned toward the opening, the light remained steady behind him, unchanged, not fading, not growing, simply continuing, as though it no longer needed to be discovered. And as he stepped back toward the stairs, leaving the chamber as he had found it, he understood that some places are not meant to be owned or taken, but carried forward quietly, in the way a person chooses to live after learning how to listen.